Okay, thank you for joining. We're going to just give it an extra minute and then we will begin. Okay, let's kick off. So welcome everyone to this online report launch for the latest Climate Change Committee report that was published earlier this month, Investment for a Well-Adapted UK. My name is Ben Caldecott. I'm a member of the Adaptation Committee of the CCC and will be chairing today's event. The CCC prepared the report for a variety of reasons. So firstly, improved climate resilience requires significant investment. Investment will be needed to create new assets to protect the UK against climate impacts. Secondly, existing investment flows will need to be delivered in a way that is resilient to future climate conditions. Thirdly, we'll need investment from both the public and private sectors. How can we mobilize both at sufficient scale and pace? What can policymakers and regulators do to unlock that capital? Those are questions we examine in the report. And while the financial community has been very successfully, well, maybe not successfully yet, but has been very much focused on net zero, adaptation has been less well understood. And how can we change that? So as you'll hear from colleagues, the report highlights some of the priorities for adaptation, particularly in the UK, obviously, pinpoints the barriers to capital flowing where it needs to, and sets out a vision for how we can solve some of these issues and questions. Now, the event today, we've structured it in the following way. So we're going to have a short presentation on the key findings of the report from my colleague Bea Natzler from the CCC. She leads the people and business team at the CCC, and her team conducts analysis and provides advice to government on the role of society in progressing towards net zero and a climate resilient future. One footnote, and this is a footnote that's about how we do analysis in the CCC. So Bea's team covers both net zero and adaptation and resilience. And there's been a big effort to try and integrate the analytical resources across the CCC to ensure joint working between mitigation and adaptation. After Bea gives that presentation, we're going to have a few responses from panelists. So we're first going to hear from Emma Howard-Boyd, who is chair of the Green Finance Institute. Many of you will know Emma from a variety of positions and roles. She was chair of the Environment Agency until last year, and she's currently chair of the Green Finance Institute. She's also chair of the advisory board for the Centre for Greening Finance and Investment, and as a UN Global Ambassador for Race to Zero and Race to Resilience. So Emma will be our first respondent. We'll then hear from Caroline Hass from NatWest Markets, where she's head of climate and ESG capital markets. Our next respondent after Caroline is Faith Ward, who's Chief Responsible Investment Officer at Brunel Pension Partnership. She's also chair of the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change, a major investor coalition in Europe. And then we'll hear from a colleague of mine on the Climate Change Committee, on the Adaptation Committee, Svenja Szyminski. And Svenja is also chair of the Munich Climate Insurance Initiative. She's a managing director for climate and sustainability at Marsh McLennan, and is a professor in practice at the Grantham Research Institute at the LSE. So after we've heard from those very distinguished respondents, we'll have a panel discussion and a Q&A, and aim to finish at 11:30. We also have other experts from the CCC analytical team. So we have Brendan Freeman, who is a senior analyst for the natural environment, who's also on the line. And if there are questions that might be relevant for the authorship team of the report, then Brendan and others might come in. Now, before I hand over to B, so in advance of the Q&A, we're going to be using Slido for Q&A. Many of you will have used Slido before. So there is in the chat details of how you can log into Slido. You can start posting your questions straight away if you would like, or as you get inspired by the contributions from our different respondents, and indeed during the Q&A. You can upvote questions as well to help make sure they get asked and hopefully answered. So without further ado, over to you, B. Thank you for kicking us off.
Thanks, Ben, and good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. So I'm going to take you through at a high level for about 20 minutes the key messages that came out from our report on investment for a well-adapted UK. And just want to thank the Adaptation Committee, including Ben and Svenja, who are on the line this morning, and the team who led on this report, including Brendan Freeman, Richard Miller, and David Stiles. Next slide. So I'm going to take you through to start with what we see as the key investment needs for a well-adapted UK, why we need to be putting investment towards this priority at this point. And then secondly, the key barriers that we mapped to those investment flows. Thirdly, some instruments that can help facilitate the flow of investment that's needed. And then finally, the key recommendations that came out from our report. Before I go on to that, just a quick note on who the Climate Change Committee are. Through an independent statutory body that was established under the Climate Change Act in 2008. And our purpose is to advise the UK and devolved governments on their emissions targets. And we've produced reports for Parliament on the progress the government makes towards reducing both greenhouse gas emissions, but also adapting to the impacts of climate change. So it's within that second piece, the sort of adapting to impacts of climate change, that we chose to focus on adaptation for investment in this report. Great, so why do we need to invest in adaptation in the UK? Next slide. So as you can see on the graph on the right, even if we manage to sort of rapidly start to reduce emissions from now, as the UK has committed to, if all current global commitments are followed, if you look at that green line, we can expect the annual UK temperature in the coming decades to continue to increase. So climate change to a point is already locked in. So what does this mean? It means that in the UK, in terms of direct impacts, we can expect to see an increase in the severity and frequency of UK heat waves. We can expect to see a change in UK rainfall patterns and also a rise in sea levels around the UK coast in the next century. There's not just these direct impacts to think about, though. There's a variety of impacts on our wider society, economy, natural ecosystems, agricultural environments, and urban areas, which could have ripple effects across the economy. And finally, we live in an increasingly interconnected world, so the impacts of climate change globally could have a significant impact on the UK due to things such as our supply chains. Next slide. So what does this really mean in terms of costs to the UK? So it's pretty hard to estimate, and there's a lot of uncertainty within it, but it's clear that the costs will be significant. So some estimates place it at between 1 to 4% of UK GDP by 2050 in terms of cost to the UK economy. But it's worth noting that this could be a lot higher given the significant uncertainty around climate tipping points, which would lead to a lot higher costs. In our climate change risk assessment a few years ago, we looked at a specific subset of risks that could be quantified and found that the cost was at least 5 to 10 billion per year by 2050 if we assume a course where we only rise by 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels by 2100. So despite the uncertainty, the message is clear: the costs in our current status are going to be high. And when we think about it from a UK financial system perspective, it's also pretty concerning. So the Bank of England did some analysis that showed that if we take no further action to adapt the UK to these impacts of climate change, climate risks will be a persistent drag on bank and insurer profitability, and up to 10 to 15% at our current sort of no action status. Some positive news, though, in that if we do take action, it's clear that the costs can be a lot lower, which brings me on to the next slide. Which encouragingly shows that for a lot of the key adaptation actions that we need to take, such as strengthening early warning systems for heat waves and other climate change risks, nature restoration, making new infrastructure more resilient, and investing in natural and technological flood and water management, the benefits are seen to outweigh the costs by sometimes up to a 10 to 1 ratio. So you can see in this diagram here, there's quite a range in terms of evidence, but it's clear that a lot of the actions, it would make sense from a societal perspective to be invested in. Next slide. Great. So what does this mean in terms of investment? We want these adaptation actions to take place. They obviously need money to support them. And as Ben set out at the start, there's broadly 3 categories of the kinds of investment being needed. So in one area, there's some actions that need significant additional investment. So in particular, where we need new assets or services whose primary purpose is to build resilience to weather and climatic conditions. So an example of this would be investing in flood defences, which have the sole or primary aim of reducing risks of flooding, which can be exacerbated by climate change. The second category is climate proofing existing investment flows. So for example, planned investments in additional offshore wind capacity. So these investments are already planned, but they could have greater climate resilience benefits if they're delivered in a range of locations, making the overall system less vulnerable to potential future wind droughts. In many cases, there may be some additional costs associated with climate proofing these non-adaptation investment flows, but this can vary across asset type and climate hazard. And then finally, there's some key adaptation actions that don't actually require upfront investment. So for example, changes in how occupants manage their houses during heat waves through appropriate opening and shutting of windows, drawing of blinds, can influence overheating risks. Great. So to help really focus and make this concrete, in our report, we decided to focus on 5 key focus areas that span different investment challenges. So I'll just briefly speak you through each of those now. So the first is nature-based solutions to help manage flood risk. So this includes actions to restore, protect, and enhance the ability of natural ecosystems to provide critical services. So examples could be planting trees and increase vegetation along riverbanks to bolster the soils available to stay intact. Or along the coast, it could include improving the condition of coastal habitats to enable them to better insulate and act as a barrier against coastal surge. And a key thing to note about nature-based solutions is they can often come with a wider range of co-benefits, whether that's for biodiversity or also helping to achieve some of our net zero goals. The second adaptation action that we looked at in detail in this report is sustainable urban drainage systems, sometimes referred to as SUDs. So these are water management practices designed to manage rainwater locally, and they're usually implemented within urban areas as a sequence of techniques such as permeable paving or soakaways, and they work together to manage surface water. Investment in SUDs is required for new developments in flood risk areas and is often funded by developers or local authorities. The third focus area was retrofitting homes to reduce overheating risk. So homes across the UK will need to be retrofitted with passive or active cooling measures to reduce internal temperatures during periods of high temperature, such as what we experienced in the summer last year. And this varies in terms of what it looks like a lot by building type and location. Fourthly, we looked at climate proofing infrastructure. So there are increasing risks to infrastructure from high temperatures, flooding, drought, coastal erosion, and potentially wildfire in the coming decades. So there's sort of 2 parts to this. So the first is that existing energy networks, roads, and rail infrastructure need additional spending to make sure they can continue to operate effectively under these conditions. And then investments that we're hoping to see to upgrade new technologies to support net zero delivery should also, while they're being upgraded, integrate and be climate proof themselves. And then finally, drought resilience in the public water system. So this will probably be fresh on people's minds from last summer, but following a trend towards hotter and drier summers in the UK, there's a need to invest to manage the increasing risks of future water shortages due to climate change. So those are the 5 areas that we'll be focusing on in this report. And so we had a go at estimating for each of these areas broadly what the investment needs would be. This is quite challenging because without a clear vision for what a well-adapted UK would look like from the government, it's hard to know what the goalposts are. So for example, the investment level needed to ensure that the water system is resilient to, say, a 1 in 200 year drought would be very different to the level of investment needed to ensure that it was resilient to a 1 in 500 year drought. So some uncertainty with these ranges, but they're hopefully still helpful as an indicative figure. Other estimates have put the overall investment need per year at around £10 billion. And just to put this in context, that's around roughly 1/5 of the additional investment that we see needed for the net zero transition. So a sort of significant but achievable amount of investment. Next slide. Great. So that sets out the sort of broad where we need to get to, why this is so important. So the next question really is, why isn't this already happening, given there's clear benefits to society, the benefits outweigh the costs, and there's high costs of no action as well. So we looked into this in some detail in this report and identified 4 broad barriers to investment that can help explain why to date we're not seeing the levels of adaptation investment we might expect given the benefits that they bring. So the first is market and financial barriers. So there's often low or no revenues from climate risk reduction. And while there's a high economic return, there's a low financial or internal rate of return. So it's hard for those investing in these actions to really capture the benefits. Often adaptation actions have an element of being sort of public goods, such as flood defences. So it's hard as well to make sure that investment happens through private markets. And finally, benefits are often far in the future, and due to discounting, they're therefore less attractive. The second key barrier is information barriers. So there's insufficient information often on the climate risks and how exactly they will materialise, and information gaps on the adaptation actions, effectiveness and benefits across different options, how they vary over space and time, etc. And at times there can be limited understanding in the investment community of adaptation. The third barrier is bankability. So projects are often pretty complex, both in terms of time and resources. There can be a lack of experience and skills to deliver the adaptation projects and financing. And the large number of actors in terms of beneficiaries, different organisations, can add to the complication. Fourthly, policy and regulatory barriers. So at times there's regulation that provides insufficient incentives or sometimes disincentives to investing in adaptation. There can be limited join-up and cooperation within and across sectors, and policy uncertainty can make it hard for long-term investments and planning. And then finally, behavioural barriers. So there can be a low willingness to pay for adaptation, sometimes based on a belief that it's purely the government's role to ensure the UK is adapted, and a general perceived lack of urgency to adapt, possibly linked to how hard it is to comprehend slow onset or low probability risks. So those could all sound quite high level and theoretical, but we've mapped these against and gone into some detail for each of the adaptation actions that I spoke through earlier. I won't go through these all in detail, though I'd encourage you to dive into the report if any are of particular interest. But just as a couple of examples, so for nature-based solutions to help manage flood risk, that's the first column on the left, you can see there's a particularly high barrier in terms of market and financial barriers and information barriers. So there's often a lack of information on the cost and effectiveness of nature-based solutions, a lack of accessible finance, and also inappropriate regulation and legislation that can mean that the multiple benefits the nature-based solutions can deliver, such as to ecosystems, biodiversity and net zero, aren't fully captured or monetized. And then sort of on the other end, if we look at the public water system, you can see slightly more positive picture there in terms of the RAG ratings. So although barriers do remain for water, there has been some positive development. So for example, there's established planning processes which incorporate climate change and approaches to accelerate infrastructure investment and raise awareness of investments of water efficiency in homes. So a mixed picture, but broadly, clearly quite a lot of barriers that we still need to address. Okay, great. So which then leads us to the question, what instruments can we use to make sure that investment does flow into these adaptation actions, and hopefully instruments that can help address some of those barriers we just spoke through. So many adaptations provide widely distributed and often difficult to quantify benefits, such as investment in flood defences to protect key towns and cities, and investment in the provision of ecosystem services. So this points to the need for higher levels of public investment to support those areas of climate resilience, even where it's combined with private sources. So when we think about revenue streams, we divide them into 3, but the sort of primary one we look at is public investment. But as I mentioned, it won't be sufficient on its own to deliver adaptation, and there's a key role for private investment to lead the way in certain areas. So private enterprise will need to invest in aspects of resilience where there are key beneficiaries, financed through either financial markets or internal investment. And depending on the sector, the business may be able to pass on some of the costs of the adaptation investment through to their customers. We're seeing private enterprises increasingly measuring climate risk and developing plans, helped in part by TCFD, ISSB, and other such initiatives, but it's not yet clear if this is driving any increase in levels of private investment into climate adaptation. And then finally, the third revenue stream we can consider is from private households themselves. So some adaptation investment will come directly from household expenditure, such as investment to retrofit homes to reduce overheating risk. And this won't then have associated revenues. So we've mapped these potential revenue sources against those key adaptation action areas that I mentioned at the start. And you can see for different ones, there's different ways of directing funding flows. So for example, for nature-based solutions, we see a key role for public funding through things such as the Environmental Land Management Scheme, but also the potential for private revenue flows to really step in, whether that's through impact investment, ecosystem credit, or payments for ecosystem services. And we think like throughout this, a really key takeaway is the need for accurate and agreed methods for monetizing the benefits of adaptation actions. So often the benefits from adaptation actions are complex and will require new and innovative methodologies that are simple to use but remain scientifically robust. So we need to see consensus building through the establishment of standards for measuring and monetizing adaptation benefits, with government playing an important role here. And you can see that will be particularly important for things such as, say, ecosystem credits, where it can be quite hard to capture the true benefits. And then secondly, the other thing we think that could really help with this are demonstrator projects. So adaptation projects using innovative funding and financing approaches can serve as templates for others to copy and help provide confidence that successful and profitable projects can be delivered in reality. And there's a role for government there, along with its agencies, to support these innovative funding demonstrators and document and publicise the learnings from them. So just an example of a potential demonstrator project. So a few years ago, the community around the River Wyre recognised that there was a real investment need for floods mitigation. So over 4 years, they'd experienced 3 floods that were 1 in 50-year floods. So a really sort of high flood risk there. And this comes with quite a cost. So in general, the cost of a 1 in 50-year flood to insurers is a little under £2 million. So there was a clear investment need there to invest in flood mitigation measures. And this was successfully achieved through a combination of approaches and most critically through sort of public-private partnerships. So there was a combination of grant funding up front and then impact investment. And something that really helped secure and deliver the impact investment was being able to really capture the benefits in a monetized form to reduced flooding, as well as using ecosystem benefits and carbon credits as well. Great, next slide, please. Great, so finally, what does this mean for what we need to see going forward in terms of ensuring that we really use some of these financing mechanisms, direct them towards the right adaptation actions, and make sure different stakeholders and actors in the space can play their role? So we've got 6 broad recommendations that have come out from the report. So the first is the government needs to clarify adaptation goals and roles for investment. So the next national adaptation programme should set out a really clear vision for a well-adapted UK with specific targets, so it's clear what we're aiming for and therefore what level of investment is really needed. And the updated green finance strategy, which we're expecting in the coming months, should clarify where adaptation will be publicly or privately funded. Secondly, we want to see markets created that really value adaptation outcomes. Government can play a role here in helping create markets for this, including through carbon market integrity schemes and the Environmental Land Management Scheme. And industry regulators and implementing agencies should have resilience standards aligned to national objectives to help deliver this through the piece. Thirdly, we need to see leadership from the public sector. So we'd like to see the Office for Budget Responsibility to do a full review of the impacts of climate change on the UK macroeconomy and public finances to really build the evidence in that space. And for government and implementing agencies to ensure a growing fraction of their funds support those pioneering projects or demonstrators that I just spoke through. Great. And then fourthly, we think that the corporate disclosure regimes that exist and are doing a good job and are really positive could be further strengthened. So we'd like to see the sustainability disclosure regime to help improve an understanding of adaptation investment needs, and for the government to build on the good work of the Transition Plan Task Force to define standards for high quality adaptation plans. We'd like to see financial regulators empowered to address risks. So, for example, the Bank of England could examine how capital requirements for banks should be adjusted based on climate risks, and financial regulators themselves should provide directional guidance for financial institutions to measure physical climate risk and their contribution to climate adaptation outcomes across portfolios. And then finally, we see a really critical role for public financial institutions, such as the UKIB, the BBB, the BII, and the UKEF. We think they could create adaptation finance strategies to set out how they'll independently and collectively ensure that no viable adaptation project fails due to a lack of finance. Great, that was a high-level overview, but if you're interested to sort of dig into the detail of our analysis, I'd really encourage you to go to the Climate Change Committee website, where our full report can be found alongside the supporting research that fed into that report. Great, thanks so much, and I'll hand back to Ben.
Great, thanks so much, Bea. Fantastic presentation. canter through all the issues, the arguments, and the key recommendations. So Emma, you've very kindly agreed to be our first respondent. Thank you for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you, Bea, for that fantastic presentation. It's great to join you all today and to hear a little bit more about the excellent report with its strong call to raise the level of ambition on financing climate change adaptation in the UK. I was particularly pleased to hear, firstly, Ben, in your introductory comments about the integration of the work at the Committee on Climate Change, making sure that work on adaptation and net zero is very closely aligned and working together. And B, for you to highlight the example of the River Wire and how that particular pilot project has actually led to investment. That is something that the Environment Agency, DEFRA, the Esme Fairbairn Foundation and Triodos Bank were involved with, as well as other organisations that were involved in and now will start paying the revenues, and is a great example of how a pilot will hopefully move into scaling up and other examples of investment. Energy security and more recently food security have been the focus of political attention, dominating the headlines. And I would like to see climate security given the same emphasis, not just here in the UK, but globally. We are experiencing a century of climate change. Already around the world, there's almost a daily roll call of climate-related weather events. And now is the time for the UK to demonstrate leadership on climate security, building on its strength of science, innovation, engineering and finance sectors, particularly in insurance markets. As Baroness Brown has clearly stated when the report was published, adaptation, preparing for climate hazards in the UK remains chronically underfunded and overlooked, and this must change. In common with net zero, a major programme of investment is required to meet the UK's adaptation needs. But unlike net zero, the government has not defined its priorities, and this lack of clarity is preventing progress on appraising the country's investment needs and closing the adaptation gap. So be clear, this risks undermining our net zero investments. If we do not properly consider rising floods and extreme heat, net zero infrastructure could become prematurely obsolete, literally washing away in a flood or melting in a heat wave. I'd like to see a profound shift in the resilience narrative, by which resilience becomes a core component of innovative strategic decision making. A rigorous integration of these risks should allow the unlocking of the upside, enabling countries and investors to become more competitive, attractive, and strategic instead of being penalised for acknowledging their exposure. And your report is extremely helpful in this regard. We need to stop seeing innovation and resilience as risky and therefore more difficult, expensive to attract and expensive to attract finance, and start seeing not innovating and building resilience as risky, broadening the scope of risks and the timescale over which they are considered. And there are a number of initiatives. We've talked about the pilot project up in the River Wire, but also things like the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investments Physical Climate Risk Assessment methodology, which was published last autumn, to address the massive resilience gap in financing. And again, this tool book, this guide, this practitioner's guide supplies the practical tools to identify and assess the resilience of infrastructure assets. So as far as your key recommendations are concerned, I agree with you that the forthcoming third National Adaptation Plan, NAP3, and the forthcoming Green Finance Strategy, which is going to come out in the next few months, we understand, are fantastic opportunities to highlight the importance of adaptation finance. I'm really keen. In the past, I've called for a greater focus on standards and indeed some sort of review around the resilience standards and the level of adaptation and resilience, what a good adapted UK looks like. So again, really like the calls that you have put into your report for an assessment of this sort of type. And again, just recognising that we need to look at different forms of adaptation and resilience alongside different types of finance, and really get into the nitty-gritty of what this means. Often when government has launched a task force, and we've seen it with the Green Finance Task Force, we've got it now with transition plans, it really over a short period of time puts a great deal of focus on driving improvements. And I'm wondering whether this is something that could be set out as part of the next green finance strategy, to make sure that we're bringing not just financiers, but academics and engineers into really understanding what is needed to make sure that we're funding, investing in climate resilience in the way that we need to. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Emma, and also for emphasising the importance and role, particularly of the forthcoming green finance strategy as well, which I agree is a big opportunity. Caroline, thank you also for being a respondent, and thank you for going next. Over to you.
Great. Thank you very much. Obviously, there was a fair call out around investment and the markets and the understanding of the markets around adaptation. Now, I think one kind of has to take a little bit of a step back, and it's probably the fact that there has been a tremendous amount of focus on transition risk, which obviously was called out throughout the system. It was also very much where some of the regulators focused on initially. And so as a result, it kind of ended up kind of driving people's attention very quickly to transition versus looking at the more physical risks associated with climate change. And I think it's interesting because climate change, or the physical climate change, is actually really physical. You can see it, it's visual, it's in front of us. But in many ways, it's only now starting to really hit home. And I think the example of, the wire and how many floods were happening, whereas one assumed this was a 50-year event. Now, obviously, insurance companies have been dealing with different types of physical event risk for a long time, but that has not really fed through the rest of the financial ecosystem. And I think even now, it was one thing that was very much called out by the PRA when we did all the BES work and we actually looked at the bank's balance sheets and the risks associated with physical risk, that in many ways, it wasn't actually done sufficiently. So what you're seeing is actually the banks also being pushed back now to revisit what their portfolios are. Inherently, there are challenges with that. And some of that is in the reporting, that we actually don't have geo-based reporting for our companies and the activity. So for us to actually look at the scenario analysis of what that impact could be makes it actually quite challenging. And so these are some of the, I would say, probably really granular barriers that we are faced with, is actually trying to get down into that details as we do when we start to look at transition and emissions risk. But at the same time, I think actually we can see it already coming through. The green bond frameworks already have that ability to include physical risk and the investments into that area. Thames Water already has done that and very much looked at, kind of their treated volumes of wastewater, the reduced market-based, and then linked it back. And I think this is another one. They link it back to the more transition risk and the carbon numbers. And so I think that is actually a real sort of co-benefit one can think about as you start to think about what is the narrative that links back to what people can already address and are associated with, to how do we actually gain a greater focus and awareness around the physical risks associated with climate change. I think it's also interesting, and it was definitely beneficial, that the UK Green Gilt already also include adaptation in the framework. And I think it's interesting to note, of the allocated funds of the green bond issuance between 21 and 22, which was a total of about 8.8 billion, 1.1 billion was actually allocated to the Environment Agency's flood program, which equated to about 13% of the allocation. And in their report, they also called out that it was actually improved flood protection for over about 314,000 homes, which already exceeded the target of 300,000. Now, these are still few and far between, but I think it is exactly these examples that we need to build upon and really increase the understanding and awareness of that. While I think as much as we can, linking it back to that slightly more well-trodden path so that one starts to connect the two impacts. And I think that, will very much lead. Now, I think I've sort of, a classic example, and this was called out in the report as well, is, looking at public sector and how they actually incorporate this. And for example, in the Holland, there is an agency that ultimately just looks at that, which is Nederlands Waterschapsbank. And it is fantastic to see how their program and the way they built it into their sustainable financing program is constantly reiterating the importance of the flood defenses in the Netherlands. So it is possible, and investors are there to listen. I think it's just, we probably need to just kind of probably clarify some of it and just bring it more and more to the forefront. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Caroline. And I know there's some things that you've raised that I definitely want us to come back to in the Q&A, particularly around sustainability linked instruments that you were referring to. Faith, thank you for joining us. And you bring a really important asset owner perspective to all of this. So over to you.
Thank you, Ben, and completely support all the comments that have been made so far, and thank you very much for having the opportunity. It is a topic I feel quite passionate about, and sometimes actually fueled by anger, actually, at sometimes some of the situations that we find ourselves in. I am an asset owner, as you say. I'm part of the Brunel Pension Partnership. We are a global investor. We have about 35 billion of assets under management, so we're trying to cover this issue in a global context. But I know today we're focusing a little bit on, for that's much on the Adapted UK. Before commenting on this report, I just wanted to touch on another report that we use quite extensively in our work, which is the World Economic Forum sort of Global Risk Report. It's in its 18th edition. It came out at the mid-January. And it clearly identified that both companies and business leaders are seeing kind of climate risk going up the agenda. It dominates the top 4 in looking at that 10-year perspective. And actually in the more near term, dominates the top 5 in about 16 countries, as Caroline said, unsurprisingly in the Netherlands, amongst all of them. So there's definitely a growing recognition of the perception of climate risk. Adaptation comes in at number 2 in that list. But I wanted to quote something that comes underneath that analysis that I think kind of really sums up some of the challenges that we have. The diversion of attention and resources towards adaptation may further slow the progress of global targets in countries who make the biggest contributors. Now, I was quite cross at raising that, as you can imagine. So whilst I hold the WEF report in high regard, and we find it very useful, to create a false dichotomy between attention to mitigation and attention to adaptation as if they're an either or, I think is actually deeply unhelpful. And I think the report is actually, the report that we're launching today, I think has done an excellent job, and summarised it very eloquently. Some of the challenges, it is harder in adaptation than it is in mitigation. And I think we need to sort of, and we've acknowledged that ourselves. So one of the other things we've done recently is published an update of our own climate policy at Brunel. And we acknowledge, and I was quoting from this one, we acknowledge that physical risks and climate change and the focus on adaptation and resilience has not had the attention required by companies or investors, and forms an essential part of our fiduciary duty. So even somebody as passionate myself completely acknowledges we have not done enough by any margin at all. And I was trying to think through reading this. I mean, the report very much goes into perhaps some of the challenges around the carrots, as the expression goes, in terms of how can you kind of make this, particularly for private capital, sometimes it's less obvious or harder to extract, particularly say in a private context, what some of those carrots might be. But actually the stick is almost completely absent as well. And I think this is a challenge outside of Brunel Pension Partnership, which is not a coincidence, which includes the Environment Agency. My feet are not held to the fire for my lack of action on adaptation. I don't have NGOs, beneficiaries, anybody writing to me and calling me to account for the fact that I have not engaged on this, or I've not done that. I mean, we do, but nobody holds me to account in the same way they do if I have holdings in Shell or BP. And I get a lot of correspondence on our investments in sort of like the mining or the oil and gas sector, and yet nothing. So that accountability, that stick, is just not there. And I do think that's one of the areas where I felt the report possibly building on Emma's comments, I think possibly pulled its punches, is that I think we need to have lack of action on adaptation be as socially unacceptable as lack of action on mitigation. And it currently just isn't, it just isn't there. So the area where we can get sort of more accountability, as Bea kind of outlined, is around some of these sort of reporting mechanisms. Bea talked about kind of building, and I think Caroline sort of also built on this too, about building on the work of the TPT and the transition plans. However, at the moment, I would say that's really weak. So I think in the ISSB, the TPT, SSDR, name a number of acronyms that you like, adaptation is a poorer cousin by a country mile. Basically, it does not get the coverage that it needs. Its emphasis is woefully inadequate. So although there is the capacity to use those mechanisms, and I absolutely completely support that, at the moment it's not in your face enough. It's not forcing investors to take the action that's actually desired. I thought the report was absolutely excellent, and I would highly commend it to anybody in sort of private finance or anybody to read it. But obviously my role here is to kind of speak for sort of the private finance. I thought it was really good, and I found it really helpful, not least because I know that we need more to be more equipped as investors to sort of to take action. So what is it actually Brunel's done? So I've done a lot of moaning there. So what is it I'm actually doing ourselves to kind of move forward? Well, we are trying to move forward in our stewardship. We're going to be advocating much more powerfully, both with policymakers. There's loads, and I'm sure we'll dig into these. The policy problems are manifold in terms of some of the challenges around that, but also stewardship with companies. How can we get the companies to actually make some of the capital investments and encourage that activity? We'll be doing analytics on our listed holdings and actually have a dedicated programme specifically focusing on this issue in our stewardship programme. Within our private markets, it's already part of our due diligence, but it's about taking it up a level and also being able to report and evidence this. There's actually some fantastic examples actually within our private markets within Brunel and some of the investments we've made, and I might touch on some of those later, where some of the managers are doing some fantastic work in setting out sort of plans to retrofit and build in adaptation to their, particularly in real estate and infrastructure. Got some excellent examples, but it's about being able to evidence that. And I think there's a part of them, I think the report talks about leadership. If we can see examples, it kind of has that sort of natural sort of snowballing effect. One of the tools we'll use is the CRAM tool, which is the climate risk real estate model, which we're asking this year. We'll be demanding more transparency in terms of the models that are identifying the value of the risk, and then what are the real estate managers doing in response to that. Finally, also putting our money where our mouth is. It is an explicit part of our next round of our infrastructure and our infrastructure cycle in terms of our investments. We've identified the environmental objectives and a dedicated area to climate solutions, of which adaptation is a component part. And whilst it is still more tricky, I think there is the desire there to try and find investments in that space. So can't guarantee it because you have to see what opportunities present themselves. But I think there is that we are very much kind of really trying to up our game and sort of encourage other investors to do likewise. To help us on that, you mentioned the fact I'm chair of IGCC, and IGCC itself is also upping its game in supporting investors and taking action, and it's got a programme of work around climate resilience investment framework, which it did a consultation, and it's building that work, and that you'll see an awful lot more coming through to support investors in the coming months, I think, to take action. So a bit of moaning, but also what some tangible actions that as an investor in this space that we're taking. So hopefully that's helpful, some things to dig into. I'm sure we'll stir a few questions as well.
Thanks, Faith. And it wasn't just moaning, it was constructive moaning. So very, very important. I mean, I think one of the things we also talk a lot about in the report is understanding the contributions that investors and financial institutions are making to actually not just to positive adaptation outcomes, but negative ones. So practices, investments that are actually resulting in maladaptation and undermining societal resilience. So we need to understand that more, and our ability to understand that's quite constrained, but that's also very important. Okay, things we'll come back to in the Q&A, but Svenja, colleague on the adaptation committee, over to you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. It's great to be here. I think first of all, I really want to praise the report. I mean, I have to say it's really an excellent piece of work, and the committee team, but also several of the underpinning case studies that underpin it. So, really take some time and look at those. I mean, it's not just a report, it has a lot of examples. And I think, the timing of the report is actually really crucial. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So, first of all, big compliment to all those who were involved. I think, it's urgently needed for government, I think, but also for the finance sector and for businesses. And I am actually so pleased when I looked at the attendee lists that we actually have quite a good and varied participation here. And I think this is really also at the heart of, I guess, Ben, when both of us joined the committee last year, I think we're really keen to have also greater interactions and engagement with the business and finance world. Because I think, as we've heard, adaptation remains in a way the Cinderella of the climate finance discussion. And that might sound fun, or Cinderella, but I think it's a real concern, because I think there are two clear points. We can't achieve net zero without adaptation. I think that is essential, and there are lots of reasons why, and if you read the report you'll understand. But also, adaptation is an investment, and too often I think it's still seen as a cost, or when we say investment, it's really difficult to capture the co-benefits, and it requires new mechanisms. So I think the report really tries to disentangle that and outlines ways forward, and I think that's actually really, really important. Faith, you mentioned the global risk report. For me, the key takeaway was actually the growing concern about failure of adaptation in there, because I think that was like the second or third highest ranking risk. And I think that acknowledgement that actually people are concerned about the failure of adaptation, well, that's quite an achievement, I would say. The flip side would be, okay, well, if you're concerned about failure, why are we not acting on it? And I think this is the interesting part, I think, with adaptation. We've come a long way in our understanding of the risk. And, quite naturally, when you start an adaptation conversation, you say, well, let's first assess the risk and understand the risk. And yes, of course, that is important. But to be frank, we never had a better understanding of the physical risks and also of the responses needed. I think where we're actually really still struggling is to then translate that into action. And, I think to have plans and policies and, a pathway is a good thing. And definitely we need that. But I think it's also really important that these get implemented. And the Committee on Climate Change, our statutory duty is to check progress in adaptation. And indeed, we will later this year publish our next adaptation progress report. And in there, I always get immensely frustrated, because we're also looking at the quality of plans and policies and proposals. And I always shake my head and say, well, we really need to measure the quality of the adaptation on the ground. And I think that's really what this needs to be all about. I mean, adaptation is no longer just a sort of distant concept. It's, the failure to adapt is visible right now. I mean, we see that when you look back at the extreme events across the world. And I think, our failure to act in anticipation early to reduce risk and to prevent that, that just makes it more costly. And I think, this is really where I have the hope that this report, points out the barriers, but doesn't stop there, and also sort of takes then, some of these really fascinating innovations into account. So, I think it's really important to understand the risk and focus on the risk assessment side, but don't stop there. And I think that's where we're at the moment a bit stuck when we look at disclosure, for example, when we look at adaptation reporting. It usually just captures, the risk itself, but it doesn't really go into the detail of, the what's happening in terms of addressing the risk. And I think there I want to finish also with a bit of a pitch and a plea. I mean, the Committee on Climate Change is also responsible for the UK climate change risk assessment. And we've now entering the fourth cycle of this. So we've had UK climate change risk assessment 1, 2, and 3. I had the pleasure of writing the business and industry chapters for 2 and 3. And, you know, I think we really could have done better with engaging with the business and finance sector, and also taking into account the analytics, the insights that exist in this sphere. So I think as we're now entering the fourth round, the fourth cycle, I think, well, Ben and I are kind of adamant, you know, the committee's team is also really geared up to have better engagement with the business and finance committee. So I think this report is actually a really good starting point for that. Yeah, and then hopefully we will soon be able not just to point out, you know, that there are gaps and, you know, that it is urgent, but also to point out that, you know, we are starting to see progress, and that the capital that needs to be invested in adaptation is actually flowing. And with that, yeah, looking forward to the discussion.
Great, thanks, Sonia. So lots of interesting points made by all the respondents, and now we're going to have some time for a Q&A. A quick reminder that if you've joined late, you can ask questions via Slido, and if you've arrived on time, you can also, or you're still on the call, have a look at Slido, and you can upvote questions as well, and I'll take a look at those shortly. But before we go to Slido, I have a couple of questions I want to ask panelists. So first question, and this is to Emma first and then to Faith. How does investing in adaptation for a physical asset differ to investing in addressing systemic risk?
Thank you, Ben. That's a great question, and I think something that is going to be absolutely key to making sure that the UK, or indeed anywhere in the world, is well adapted to climate risks. We've got a number of examples, quite iconic ones, where you may get the individual asset being made resilient to, for example, flooding. I think various buildings in New York, but I can also think of at least one conversation that I've had around a shopping centre in an area of the UK that floods quite frequently. And the effort is put into making that particular asset resilient to flooding. But then it stands in splendid isolation when the flooding occurs, because if you haven't invested in better protecting the road infrastructure, the rail infrastructure, you may be stuck shopping as a worker, or at a shopping centre as a worker, or indeed as someone else as footfall, and unable to get there or get home afterwards, in some instances for many weeks, as water is slow to disappear and the infrastructure is slow to get back into being able to be used. And this is where we do need to put more emphasis in that systemic risk. Again, I have had conversations with infrastructure providers that when they have spent money making their bit of infrastructure more resilient to flooding, they have recognised that perhaps if they'd clubbed their money, put their money together with other infrastructure providers around a particular city or town, they may have been able to invest less, but gain better protection, not just for their asset, but for more assets impacted by flooding. And that is much more difficult to work out how best to invest to make sure that good overall good is being spread further. So we need to make sure that we're not just looking at assets, but we're looking at systemic risk. But that systemic risk aspect is even more complicated to do. But if you bring in different, the right collaborative network, I think it is solvable, and is one way that you share the benefits and the co-benefits beyond resilience, but also net zero, nature restoration, if you get it right. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma. Faith?
Yeah, no, I support what Emma said there and say that it kind of mirrors our experience as well. Although I think some investors are getting better at recognising kind of that bigger picture. It has been a conversation, I'd say, that's been mirrored by ourselves in terms of speaking to, partly because the models and some of the instruments and tools they're given are very asset specific and therefore are massively undervaluing the actual physical risk in terms of valuations and therefore financial risk. So I think there's some challenges in the models we have don't adequately pick up the systemic aspect of it as well. And then that just exacerbates then the conversations. I think this is where sort of investor community can bring quite a lot to the picture, because we're obviously looking at this, we own a lot of assets globally. So some of the work that might do on the sovereign debt and looking at kind of how sovereigns are making themselves more, their strength of being their adaptation strength into their sovereign bond rating could then reflect well on the private infrastructure, individual assets. So you could bring some of those different parts of the investor asset allocation together in terms of that sort of collective sort of intelligence on some of those issues. And just talking to the managers, very similar to as Emma outlined, really asking them about kind of the initial question is about the resilience of that particular asset, but then saying, and the local community, or how did that, what about the roads, the infrastructure? We have quite a lot of investments in logistics. Well, the warehouse is the least of the problem if the investment's in logistics. So the accessibility and things like that. So having those sort of conversations is becoming more commonplace, and this is what we need all sort of asset owners and asset managers to be doing, down that investment chain, to be asking these more challenging questions to make sure that we are sort of that we are addressing these issues systemically, because that's at the end of the day, it is a systemic risk that we need to address. So, but yes, more just as complicated, and as I say, the tools that we're equipped with at the moment probably don't meet the need.
And Ben, might I add, this is where having standards, understanding what you're aiming for as a country at a sort of city by city, region by region level will be really helpful for everyone to understand the standard of resilience that they're investing into, and I think would help investors gain more clarity too.
Great, thanks, Emma, and thanks, Faith. So next question, and this is for Caroline, and Faith might also want to come in on this. So Caroline, what is the one action you think a financial institution could take to help support investment into adaptation in the UK?
That's always a good question. I was sort of actually thinking back on Emma's point just a second ago, and how we do that region by region. Ultimately, it's almost creating one metric. And I think that's the hard part. That is actually because in a way, when you think about where mitigation, and forgive me, I tend to call it more transition risks, and there's different ways of kind of addressing these issues, is the advantage that you have one number that everyone seems to be now kind of mobilizing around, which obviously physical risk is very different. I think the GDP one is an interesting one, to really almost put the quantification of the loss versus the gain in a way. But what could one thing be that we would do? I would say getting actually a better understanding of the impact. And I think that is where we are working, and how to actually quantify that impact, and how you can actually look at it, and how that builds into the frameworks, because ultimately that's what we're doing, right? It's how do you package that together? And even when I think about what we did when we looked at this for the case studies, there isn't one easy kind of thing that everybody can kind of put their finger on. So I think if we can, as an industry, kind of work on maybe 3 or 4 even, I think we're already working in the right direction.
Faith, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think if problems are multifaceted, this is one of them. So to distill it to one answer, so I'm going to cheat and say that what I probably want all asset owners to be doing, and asset managers, is to set a commitment explicitly dealing with adaptation and their commitments, and then what they're going to do, the stewardship activities that might sit underneath that. So that would be engaging with policymakers, engaging with the companies and the assets and the asset managers under their remit. So it's a little bit of a cheat because it cascades down then in terms of those aspects, but we all need to make an explicit commitment to what we're actually going to do and set targets in terms of our activities. I would say around this space, we do need more explicit action.
And what would those adaptation targets sort of look like? And Swenja, did you want to come in as well on this point?
Yeah, please, you go
I was going
first.
to say, just respond to that question quickly. But I suppose from a pension fund perspective, ours will be around stewardship. So it will be around the engagement with our general partners in infrastructure, our general partners and advisors around real estate, and this the stewardship activities I've outlined in terms of the companies who are most vulnerable. When we analyse that using the tools we have, which companies are most vulnerable and what the actions they're taking about it. So it's setting a target in terms of the coverage. So in the same way, so currently, it's quite common to set yourself a target to engage based on your financed emissions. So 50%, 70%, 90% of your financed emissions, you will target and contact those companies in terms of engagement. You could do the same in terms of your physical resilience. So in terms of like a level and say, right, I'm going to take the top 20, 40, 50, however your capability and capacity is, in terms of those companies you're invested in that are most vulnerable, and commit to engage with those over the next 2 years. That type of target.
Sonia, you want to come in?
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight, I mean, there's two angles to look at this. And I guess the physical asset level, resilient angle, that's an important one. But I also noticed that there's growing demand into the sort of social side of adaptation. And if you take sort of, this ESG perspective that, that sort of a lot of investors use as framing, I get a lot of requests saying, can you explain to me how adaptation sort of, can be our way of investing in the S of the ESG and, the sort of social angle. And I think this comes back to also the co-benefit side. If you do adaptation right, there can be massive co-benefits. So I think that's another important dimension of this.
Yeah, very much agree. Okay, so another question. This is for Emma and for Caroline. So the report talks about adaptation demonstrator projects that can show the way, illustrate how this can be done properly. Are there other examples you would highlight? There's one bit of this question. The second bit of this question is, how can we ensure that the knowledge of what good looks like is widespread and shared and adopted by the right sorts of people? So Emma, do you want to go first?
Thanks, Ben. And again, this is where I think collaboration is absolutely key to spread the word. It's similar to what needs to happen with regulators as well, that those working through the environmental lens need to look through the economic lens and the financial lens and make sure that we are highlighting the many, many examples that exist. If you're looking at nature-related adaptation projects, then a good place to go to is the Green Finance Institute's Hive. Again, this has been funded by Esme Fairbairn Foundation, and the idea is not just in the UK but around the world to highlight great innovation in finance around nature, with a strong link often into adaptation. I think there's even a lesson in how organizations such as the Environment Agency make sure that they are highlighting what they are doing with other sectors, other parts of government, but also the private sector, because there's no doubt that up and down the country over the last 10 years, where the investment from government, albeit with partnership funding as well, has led to flood defences being put in place, some grey infrastructure, but some nature and green infrastructure in there as well, that we need to really show how that investment from predominantly the public sector is leading to benefits. So again, good examples up and down the country, but we need to really shine a spotlight on the protection that is brought about, but also look at other aspects of adaptation as well. The heat waves last year showed how the impacts sit on and are felt in many, many different sectors and infrastructure. We haven't really touched on food, farming and food security linked to climate change. But again, this feels like an area that is only going to need more investment and more attention. And where things are done to make improvements, we need to shine a spotlight on them. Thanks.
Thanks, Emma. Caroline, did you want to come in?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think it's so interesting because you almost have to think of this like a Venn diagram. And exactly to Emma's point, there are so many different aspects that we're trying to actually, and I think that is actually the greatest challenge for adaptation, is actually bringing that all to the forefront. Because, and this is to some extent also where the narrative is very positively changing into systems and how that full ecosystem and how the whole chain is affected. Because I actually think when you look at infrastructure and you look at project financing, a lot of this is happening. It's just not actually being called out into this area as explicitly as we probably should be. When I think of a lot of the environmental assessments that are being done and all of that for this project, actually has, again, a direct or indirect benefit from an adaptation point of view. So it's probably showing how this is actively being done day in, day out, and labeling that, because it's in pockets and we're not able to probably articulate it as well as what's generally happening on the ground. The other thing is, I think the piece, that was mentioned earlier about carbon credits or biodiversity credits is to also really sort of help from a monetization point of view. And hopefully that can also help sort of mitigate or reduce some of the funding costs associated with some of these projects and really start to think about what you can do there. It is pulling all these pieces together, which is actually the greatest challenge I think that we face.
Great, thanks, Caroline.
And I just want to briefly add the importance of the green taxonomy work, where there is an adaptation and resilience strand. I think sometimes we need to work out a way of moving away from the adaptation and resilience language, because I don't think it is always helpful. That's one of the reasons why I've started talking about climate security. But often it's better understood when you bring it down to the shade that will be required, the flood protection, the water security. And I think from an investor perspective, green taxonomy and a focus on those services and investments that will lead to greater resilience will be helpful.
Great, thank you for that. So we're going to now open it up to people that are on the line. And we have a poll as well that has been that's on Slido. And I think some of you have responded already. So which of the 5 barriers identified as the most significant from your experience? And it looks like market. Oh, okay. Well, let's give this 30 seconds for you to vote. How? All right, another 10 seconds. Okay, so market and financial out in front, followed by policy and regulation, those being the dominant two, which is very interesting. And now we've got a variety of questions, so you can take down the poll now, colleagues. And thank you for putting questions and upvoting things. So first question from the audience. Are we doing enough to track existing levels of public and private adaptation finance? How can we improve this so we know where the gaps are and whether and how we need to close them? Who wants to have a crack at that? Faith.
Just to build on Emma's point, the green taxonomy, very much that's what it should be, is just a way of tracking it, because then we've got a consistent definition as to what we're talking about. At the moment, though, particularly the EU taxonomy, it doesn't capture everything. There's no, again, back to this carrots and sticks. There isn't enough acknowledgement of the positive contribution made in adaptation financed by private company that perhaps they can't grab hold of or basically get credit for some of that expenditure in the current definitions of the EU taxonomy. So there is something that the UK taxonomy is looking at. And I know that there's a sort of dedicated group to try and sort of improve the current kind of way that is expressed, because it's not, it takes you some distance, but there's very limited areas that you can currently get credit for in a taxonomy, and we need it wider. So that's the answer. We just need to get the that could be the right conduit to the question, as it were, the answer, but we need to make it work. And at the moment, there's a risk that it won't if we just followed what the EU have done.
Yeah, thanks, Faith. B?
Yeah, very much agree with the importance of the green taxonomy. I guess the other side of it is knowing how much is enough, which is why we think it's really important for the government to set out in the NAP3 and green finance strategy sort of clear goalposts for how much, for where we need to get to in terms of UK climate resilience, and then also what that split is in terms of public-private financing, so we know where we're trying to get to.
But these tracking questions, I mean, it also in overlapping areas, you know, with the 25-year environment plan and the government's commitments around the targets for the amount of private investment going into nature, for example, you know, how do we measure that on a consistent basis, public and private? And we don't have an answer for that, nor do we have a sort of an answer for adaptation, clearly, and these things are related, so joining them up I think is important. Emma, was that a hand?
And yes, and I think you've used the figure in your report, but I often cited the IPA, the Infrastructure and Projects Authority's pipeline for infrastructure build this decade, which I think is still at 650 billion. You can see what the flood budget allocation is for a period of time. You can't actually see how and that relates to roughly 5 billion of that 650 billion, which to my mind is a thin green line of defence around adaptation and resilience. But we need to understand how much of that other infrastructure has adaptation and resilience embedded into it. And this is where the standards point, the work, the recommendation that you've called for with an Office for Budget Responsibility report looking at what a well-adapted UK looks like. We need to join these dots up, because at the moment we've only got small indicators of how much money is going into adaptation and resilience. There may be more, but equally this may be signalling that a lot is still being built without those climate shocks, those climate hazards, the way that we're flip-flopping as well from too wet to too warm, and the impact that then has on infrastructure and maintenance. So again, are we building enough into our investment strategies to make sure that we're maintaining existing infrastructure, as well as that infrastructure that we're building now that is going to be around for decades, and factoring that in too? So a lot is heading in the right direction, but a lot more could be done to join this all up. Thank you.
Ben, can I just say briefly, I mean, we haven't mentioned maladaptation in this space, and I think it's an important point to keep in mind, because when we say adaptation, yes, we clearly need more in terms of quantity, but the quality also needs to be good, and we need to actually know what we're doing with you know, these investments, and sort of monitoring the effectiveness and avoiding maladaptation, and actually avoiding also some other unintended consequences with this is really important. And that's, I think, why, you know, we need to have good monitoring systems and measuring the progress, not just in terms of money spent, but also then how effective it is.
Yeah, outcomes achieved rather than pounds invested. Okay, we've got one question that's right at the top in terms of popularity from David Vincent. So, ever since the Victorian sewers, UK governments have had to wait until there is a crisis before taking action on infrastructure. Is adaptation any different, is the question. And then a supplementary question: how is the UK doing in relation to other jurisdictions on adaptation investment? Are we lagging behind? Are we average? Are we actually we're actually doing quite well, but could do loads better? What do people think? And who wants to go first? Caroline?
Sure, I can do that. maybe I'll take the first question, or the second question first, if that's all right, because I actually do think that the UK is lagging some of our European peers. I think they have actually started to think about this a little bit more. And it comes back actually to the earlier conversation about where can this happen. And I think actually as we build it more into the actual local authorities, municipalities who are actually in control of that, to actually then pull it up, which is actually ultimately what France is doing as well. If you look at the regional governments, they are driving a lot of this, and then linking that together again with the environmental aspects or biodiversity, natural capital, and trying to kind of, as I was saying about that Venn diagram, bringing these three pieces together. Obviously the Netherlands, as you raised earlier, is definitely leading the charge because they had to. There was no option. They had to address this issue. And over time, I worry as well that the UK is going to have to do something because those floodplains are developing. There's subsidence. There's a lot of different things that are coming through, and definitely in the insurance space, are starting to call this out with regard to certain properties which may not be insurable. So, there is an absolute connectivity here that needs to be sorted. But I would tend to go, it's probably harder for a national government, and so forgive me coming from Canada, to actually try to do this versus trying to build it up from the local authorities and the municipalities to then bring it up. Now, the one piece that needs to connect that, as what I keep sort of harping on, is the metrics. And forgive me, it's a typical kind of finance perspective on this, because the more we have those metrics tied up across the UK, the easier it is to then sell it into the capital markets, because they have that North Star to follow along. So hopefully that sort of answers both questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Caroline. Faith?
Yes, and I'd say that the challenge as a global investor as well is that we're looking at these challenges globally, not just within the UK. So in terms of our bandwidth, we do need to, and that's not to say that I think that the UK needs to do better, and certainly from our perspective, a large proportion of our real estate and infrastructure is within the UK, so that kind of gives it that locus in that particular area. But trying to pick these challenges, I think sometimes the way to frame that challenge from an investment perspective is obviously the capital markets in London are exposed to that risk irrespective. So there is that connectivity back to the UK, and therefore us taking action, perhaps leading the way on establishing metrics, and the way to sort of bring this into the financial markets is we've got a really good reason to do so, not only because of our own adaptation and resilience, but actually that of our capital markets as well. So I think there's a double gain to be made there. But I will defer to others in terms of where we sit sort of relative to others on that. I think other people have that expertise. Maybe to Emma.
Emma?
This is perhaps where we need to channel some of Faith's earlier expressed anger at where we are today. And I think where you can pinpoint to different parts of the world being further advanced on adaptation and resilience, I don't think any of us are acting as swiftly and or as urgently as we need to be to address this ever-growing issue. I think, given some of the work that I have done globally, more specifically when I was the UK's Commissioner on the Global Commission on Adaptation, and work that I've done since, often it is those countries which are absolutely on the forefront of the climate crisis, who are literally one or two events away from catastrophic loss of lives and livelihoods on where they are based, that have embedded responsibility for climate change, both mitigation but preparing for these shocks, within the heart of their financial ministries, because they've literally seen GDP, large percentages of it, wiped out in former cyclones, etc. And I think this is also where we're seeing some of the innovation. I've seen a recent announcement with philanthropy and the private sector working on providing parametric insurance for women working out in the field in India, where they are suffering hugely working in 50-degree heat. This is the sort of thing that we are now experiencing, and we have a lot to learn from those parts of the world that are investing in some of the systems, some of the metrics, some of the warnings and informings that will allow their citizens to be protected in some of this extreme weather that is now experienced. And I think wherever you are, we've just got to get ahead of how we embed adaptation and resilience into the way we live our lives, but also invest in finance. Thank you.
So another question, or bringing together a couple of threads, is, so there's one question about, in the River Wire case study, where was the monetary value obtained to pay for the private investment? And I guess this is sort of a really the bigger question, a really fundamental question, and we talk about it in these terms in the report. We need investable and bankable cash flows for adaptation investments, and they are often missing. So how do we create them? What are the opportunities to do so? There's another question around, should carbon credits really be used for adaptation? That's one way potentially of creating cash flows. Is it the right way? Caroline, I wonder whether you have any views as an investor.
So I think carbon credits is one of those slightly challenged concepts generally. I think there's very strong views. Are they in or are they out? Do people like them? How are they used, etc.? I think one thing that came out of COP26 that they definitely have a role. Article 6 was relatively clear, and I think more and more as I start to think about them, if that is one of the tools, and it comes back to that kind of carrot and stick approach, then we shouldn't exclude them. And when you think of one of the examples that was raised is if we can have natural flood defenses being built, those can generate carbon credits. And that's why I sort of use it carbon and biodiversity credits, because they can be taken in both ways. And I think that's where we do need to be a bit open-minded on how these could be applied, and should not exclude them, but actually see how they kind of accelerate it. I know there was another question about innovative instruments, and we are starting to see these come to the market now, where there are actually carbon credits, particularly in the emerging markets, associated, and that can either give the investor an additional coupon uplift from the carbon credit, or the other option is actually filtering that back through to the actual source and the activity, so that one reduces the cost of financing to do this. So I think I do see the role, but I'm happy to open up to the floor. Obviously, we would say that because we are having interest in it, and we've been involved with Carbon Place and various other initiatives around carbon markets. We've used them for our own operational footprint since 2014. So I think it depends a little bit from where you're coming from as well.
Does anyone else want to come in? Emma?
Yeah, I mean, just going specifically to the question around the river wire. Again, this involved not just the investors, but those businesses that were going to benefit from the services provided from reduced flood risk. So that included the Environment Agency, Flood Re, United Utilities, and setting up a series of contracts which captured those services so that you created the flows over a period of time. I think some of the lessons learned are around the timing, and how long you invest in, and how you make sure that what is being provided exists for a number of years. And these are the sorts of things that, once worked through, you hope become scalable and usable in other projects. I think this is where the Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund also comes in. That's had DEFRA, Natural England, Environment Agency, Green Finance Institute, working with those organisations, those businesses up and down the country, which are putting together natural flood management schemes, as well as other. I mean, it's not just flood and adaptation. It does lead to mitigation finance as well. But working up the business cases, working up the models, which then can be invested in. And I think one of the things that's been great over the last few years, although we need to see it scale up big time, is where government funds have been put into these smaller pilots and going along a sort of series of, this is what we need to do next, this is what we need to do next, in order to bring in the larger amounts of funding to invest in these projects. So we need to learn from others around the world. We need to learn from what we've been doing already, scale it up, and start getting those flows happening at pace. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Emma. So we're now running out of time. So what I wanted to do is just open it up to the panel for any last contributions and reflections, if you have any. Faith?
So one of the areas that sort of touched upon is the sort of the regulatory. Certainly, I personally voted for policy and regulatory, because there are some quite perverse aspects of some of the ways that some of the measures that we do actually currently have around. If you actually retrofit, if you try to improve, sometimes your rating can actually go backwards, which is just mental. So we need to find a way of sort of making sure that the regulatory instruments that we already have, the metrics we have, do not have perverse outcomes, so that actually businesses are encouraged to actually invest in adaptation, and you don't get perverse outcomes. So there is reviews needed in some of those areas. I'd say I would particularly focus on real estate as a particular case in point around that, and things like EPC ratings and such like. There's some very strange outcomes from doing the right thing in some instances.
Thanks, Faith. Sonia?
Yeah, I mean, I think this picks up on this point of, the narrative and also the visibility of adaptation. And I think that is at the core of this. If you're an investor, or if you're an insurer, if you're a business or a regulator, you want to know, if you do this, are you better adapted? And that, I think we often still fail at that, to really clearly, make this easily visible. And there are these questions around kite mark schemes, certification of resilience, and so on, and I think they all play a role, but I think it really needs to be tangible, because then you can insert it into financial decision. When then someone approaches you and says, well, I've done X, does this give me a better credit rating? Does this mean I'm a better insurance risk? Does this mean, I'm a local authority that deserves, more inward investment? And I don't think that is happening yet. It's starting, but I think that could unleash a lot of the sort of right financial decisions around adaptation.
Thank you. Emma, did you want to come in?
Yes, I did. I wanted to finish with a huge thank you to the Committee on Climate Change and the Adaptation Committee in particular. What your report does is bring together a whole range of different strands that I and others have been working on for many years. You've brought some extra visibility to the need for adaptation finance. You've called very specifically on NAP3 and the Green Finance Strategy as two things that are being worked on this year that could make a difference to adaptation finance. There's a whole range of other things as well which are vitally important. So I suppose it's a thank you to you, but also an appeal to everybody who's listened in and everybody who will listen into this over time to make more of this area of work, because it is urgent and it deserves to be more centrally picked up across the whole of government, and not just those departments that are charged with looking after adaptation and resilience. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. Caroline?
And I'll just really quickly follow. I would have said, the report was hugely welcomed, because I think this was what's needed. It needed to be brought really to the forefront. And I think the timing is very good. There's a lot of different pieces coming together. I think what Faith called out is that commitment. If we can somehow formulate that and get actually that buy-in across to actually commit to something, and that everybody really drives this forward is super, super important. And the other one I think was very, very astute is, can we build this ever more into all the work streams that are happening, like the transition task force and all these places, and just immediately putting that in right away, then it gives this a lot more viability in the long term. And so thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Caroline, and a big thank you to the respondents, the panel, for engaging in the report and in this discussion and the questions from the audience. It is clearly crunch time, as you said, Emma, and as we say in the report, the Green Finance Strategy, NAP3, key moments this year. We need to lay the foundations to ensure that capital flows in the right direction, that we're making sure that enough capital is being deployed into adaptation so that we can have a resilient future. And obviously, if we don't make those decisions and those investments in the near term, we're gonna store up some really big issues for the UK. So I also wanted to sort of say congratulations, reiterate what Svenja and Emma and others had said to the CCC team, and thank you, Bea, for your presentation, and Brendan for being on the call as well, and for the rest of the team. Thank you for people being on the line and staying to the end. And then the final thing I wanted to say is that this is the first of what we hope will be many engagements with financial institutions and those working on finance on both adaptation and mitigation from the CCC. And so we will be in touch with you and with wider stakeholders soon about how we're going to be doing that. But it's clearly something that's incredibly important, and aligning finance with environmental sustainability, climate goals is obviously a necessary condition for mitigation and adaptation. And the UK has a particularly important role to play. So we will be engaging much more on finance and investment going forward. And on that note, we'll